So Dan, if you want to move forward, I can answer a question. Okay.
All right. Okay, so what we have now is, so at the Wisconsin RTI Center, when we're looking at schools that are implementing a multi-level system supports, we do have the school-wide implementation review, which is a self-assessment of fidelity of implementation for Wisconsin's RTI framework. So just to explain this graph in a little bit, a school's leadership team would be completing the SIR through looking at how well are they implementing the essential elements of Wisconsin's RTI framework through high quality instruction, balanced assessment, collaboration, leadership and organizational structures, family engagement, and culturally responsive practices. So this is all looking at implementation throughout the entire school. So on this graph, so overall, schools are, their overall implementation is about 76% implemented. This is based on statewide SIR data from last school year. So we had 817 SIRs that were completed. And so overall, schools are doing, they're approaching full implementation, which would be 80% or higher. However, when we're looking at family engagement, schools report that they're only at that initial implementation stage. So when you're looking at information from the National Implementation Research Network, that's all, the initial implementation stage is looking at, also known as the awkward stage. So this is where schools are trying things out throughout the entire building. They're also experiencing some resistance or difficulties. So we're seeing that family engagement is an area where schools are a little bit farther behind in terms of implementation. But when we also consider the other subscales looking at culturally responsive practices, that one is the lowest when we're looking at statewide data, whereas family engagement is a close second. So looking at this information, this is one of the reasons why we wanted to embark on these family engagement webinars, because we know that it's an important and crucial part of that multi-level system of support. So we want to ultimately see schools reporting that they're doing, that they're feeling more confident and feeling more, that they're doing more about partnering with families. So that's why our work at the center is really looking at embracing, engaging, and empowering families. So we call them the 3 E's. And I'll let Jennifer start to carry on here.
Hi, everyone. Dan, I'm hoping you'll be monitoring the questions, and I tried to answer the last one, but I'm not sure it went through. So you could check that for me. So trying to make a link between what Andy has presented, and he talked about these 3 A's, the approach, atmosphere, and attitude. We try and link that to the embrace. So how do you embrace your families? How do you approach them? What's the atmosphere in your building? What is the attitude that we have with families? A lot of our nonverbals communicate a lot to them. So, are we checking ourselves with some of the communication nonverbally and verbally? And then that engagement, so those actions that we have, and Dan showed you that slide that talks about some of the things that are low impact versus high impact. And what are some of the actions we're doing in our school? That slide is a great resource to take back to your schools and use that to kind of just check yourselves. What are we doing to engage families, and are we reaching more for those higher impact? And talking about that, that's where you're going to see some of the outcomes, is when you have some of those high impact strategies and actions happening in your building, and you're empowering families to be part of the system of helping their child be successful academically as well as behaviorally. Oh.
This is the one.
Okay. I am sorry. I was thinking that was already shared. Sorry, Dan.
That's okay.
So, so you're thinking, wow, what was she talking about? This is the slide I'm talking about. So we have these lower impact activities that happen in a school, and we think of these as, that's a way to embrace them. If you, we think back to that last slide, that's kind of these attitudes and some of these, the atmosphere. We're embracing those families, but when we start to engage them, these are some of those other actions that we're doing, like those literacy math nights, maybe some surveys to get feedback from families, back to school nights. But it's these higher impact strategies that are going to really empower those families to be part of their child's the knowledge that they develop, their skills, their habits, and to be part of the planning process with their child. And the items that are highlighted in black are actually taken from the Excellence for All, and it's specifically for family engagement. So these are things that families, which were part of that, develop these strategies. So we encourage you to take a look at this. This is on the DPI website, and we just want you to see that most of them are those high impact that are going to affect student outcomes.
And
are you going to get to those questions?
Yes, and so the downside is that I'm sharing my mouse control, so it might be hard for me to type and
okay.
click. So in the meantime, I will just click and...
That sounds great. So you can go ahead and click to the next slide then.
Okay.
And click again. Great, thanks. Just stay there. So we think about embracing. So, what do we do, and how can we honor those families that are coming in our school? So can family members see and feel and hear themselves inside your building? And if you feel that they do, what evidence do you have of this? Like, are you surveying families? Are you sitting down and having conversations with them and having that two-way communication with them? And thinking of, do your staff consider families and communities as experts on the children? How do you know this? Like, what evidence do you have that all of your staff, not just a few or pockets of staff, but everyone really feels that the families and communities are the experts on the children in this building? So, like, some schools require teachers to have positive family connections, like those postcards or phone calls, maybe texts. So if you have those positive family contacts, do the teachers see these as a checklist, or do they actually see this as a way to build relationships that benefit the student, the families, as well as the teachers themselves? Like Andy showed some research that it impacts all of that. It impacts the student outcomes, the family, the parent outcomes, as well as that parent-teacher relationships, and even teacher outcomes. It personally affects them. So is your school intentionally and authentically including families during decision making? So we know when families or when staff, when people are genuine in their interactions with us versus that superficial, the required connections that are made. We know that as humans, we can tell when it's superficial or when it's sincere. So thinking about that, what systemic practices do you have to assess that all of our staff truly believe that we want to include our families and make connections and build relationships with them? And then the final thing is, what systemic practices does our school have to include families, like on those decision-making teams? Like, do we have family community subcommittees, part of our universal PBIS team? And not just the people to create the celebrations and working at them, but how about participating in the discussions and looking at that school-wide data to help determine what the outcomes are for the children and the school and community. It's important to get that piece of that perspective from parents and community because that may shape a different decision-making outcome for your school. And also that I talked about it, sharing that information back and forth around student progress and the outcomes that we're seeing. Do we have two-way communication? Besides, we can give a lot of information, putting that on our website and newsletters, but how are we getting communication back from families? And do we know if we're getting that information to the families and back equitable to all of our families? And then Dan, if you could click again. Thank you. And the next E we talk about is that engagement, so those actions. So what is something that you do to create that welcoming and engaging environment? So how do you know if all of your parents and visitors feel welcomed when they come into your school? So an example we have is, Franklin Elementary School in Appleton, they have a bilingual secretary, which is awesome because they have a high number of students that are Spanish, so they need to be able to, answer questions and direct families to the appropriate resources in the school. And all of their schools have their signs in their buildings in English and in Spanish. So what a great way to exhibit that responsiveness to the cultures of the families that are there. And also thinking more about some of the staff reactions and body language. So how do we act when all families come into our building? There's some things that sometimes we don't really reflect upon, but it sends a message to others. So an example could be, if a principal offers a chair to a family that they're familiar with during an open house, but there's another family standing there that he's not familiar with, or he or she, and doesn't offer a chair, does that send some type of a message to that family that wasn't offered the chair? Those are just small things, but they're like microaggressions that we need to be thinking about when we're talking with families. And then what is your systemic and systematic procedure to foster relationships between families and school staff? So are there expectations from administration to foster practices? Like, is it a one-time contact, 10 times they need to connect with families? Or is it sincerely to build relationships and learn from the students and the families and the homes to have better relationships and build knowledge so that everyone can be working towards the same goal with those children?
Along those same lines, I really think it's important for administrators, and there are a lot of you on the webinar. So how are you explaining the reason why we're looking at requiring positive family contacts? So is it just to check something off a list, as Jennifer mentioned before, or are you explaining what this does and how this can work to build and strengthen that relationship between the teachers and their students?
Which kind of goes into the next point, is how does administration provide guidance and support to enable that ongoing relationship building and that authentic two-way communication? Does the school share information with community members? Are they sharing that out with not just community members, but also businesses and resources, like thinking of the libraries, police officers, just to have them participate in some of the practices that we have in our building to show the relationship and help bridge from the community into the school as well. And Dan, if you could click again to the Empower. Thank you. And then the third E is that empowering. So how are we empowering our staff to empower our families? So what are the markers that the school shares resources that parents can put in place at home to support learning? Kind of the knowledge that parents need to be able to help their child. There's new curriculums, there's new ways of teaching math, and are the parents aware of that, and are we teaching that to them? And on a daily basis, how are those parents getting that information, and are we being equitable about that? If we think of some families, technology is a huge benefit for many of us, but for some families, they don't have the technology capabilities at all the time. An example is a family might have a certain amount of data that they're allowed, and if they have 3 or 4 children, they might use up that data pretty quickly within a time period, and they aren't able to access some information after that time period. So we need to be thinking, what are other ways that families can get the information they need to support their child's learning? And like Dan mentioned, just that administration understanding why we should be connecting with families and what is the benefit for the staff members to engage the families in the school building and empowering them as well. Dan, do you want to click again? So we have this continuum of supports, and what we want you to think about is, how are these expectations shared with families? Is the mode of sharing equitable? So I just talked about the technology piece. So making sure that all families have access to it. Also, is it available in a family's native language if it's appropriate? Because a lot of times words can translate differently and different meanings, so are we making sure that that is communicated effectively to those families? And how do families know if their child is making adequate process? Do they understand what adequate process means when we send information home or when we're talking with them during parent-teacher conferences? And even more, are we like offering events that are offered at different times, thinking of people who work swing shifts or in a location that's on common grounds? An example, Bayfield will be sharing at our second webinar how they changed their parent-teacher conference setup so that it's equitable for all families. And also, again, do we include those families, all families? Do we give them a chance to be part of those decision-making teams within our building? And Dan, if you want to move on to the next slide. I know we're like over our time here. So family engagement, just thinking about this as we support students, staff, and families. As the needs of the family increase, so does the support. And that's why it's important when we think of that triangle, the PBIS triangle, and we have 80 to 90%. We need to know that we're reaching 80 to 90% of our families at that universal level, because the support increases as we move up. So how do you know that? How do you know that 80 to 90% of your families are receiving the information, have equitable access to what you have offered in your building? You can go to the next slide.
And so these are just some examples on where family engagement fits within the Wisconsin model. We will go through them very quickly. We'll just highlight a few things in each area. So looking at structures for collaboration. So do you have those grade level parent meetings? Those are also commonly referred to as academic parent-teacher teams. And for our webinar in February, we will have an elementary school from Menasha that will share their experience as one of the DPI pilot schools. And so as collaboration increases in intensity, how the families need to be more and more involved within that process. And then for looking at strategic use of data, sharing screening results, and even speaking as a parent myself, if I wasn't very familiar with the assessments my kids were taking, I would need a lot more information than the graph that I received. Also looking at surveying families, how are you getting that two-way information from families in terms of their understanding about your system? How do they understand what your expectations are academically and also behaviorally? Looking at instruction, how are you providing cool tools for families in terms of things on how to complete homework? Are you setting up some expectations in terms of going to bed routines, getting up in the morning routines? Are you providing that information? And then finally, in looking at culturally responsive practices throughout the entire system, do your teachers have that belief that families and communities are experts on their children? Are you looking at visiting families to really getting to know them? And how do you build that relationship? Do you have family photos of within your building? So any student can walk through the hallways and see a picture of their mom or their dad or their aunt or their uncle or their grandma or their grandpa. Do they see themselves in the walls and in the classrooms, in the hallways?
So just to kind of bring this all together and highlight some of this information on this page, is family engagement is a cornerstone to helping students be college and career ready. And we have many assessments that help us gauge our level of implementation, and we can actually dig deeper into these and looking at specific line items to know where our level of engaging families is. Historically, family engagement is usually one of the lowest subscales when we look at that statewide in Wisconsin, and we're making family engagement a critical component when you look at the components of a culturally responsive level of support. Family engagement is a critical piece of that, so we really want to encourage you to go back, look at some of these items in your assessments and see where are you at with your implementation and what can you do to increase that family engagement within your building.
And then also you do have a handout that does list all of the actual items within those self-assessments. And then we do have a couple of questions. So we do have Betty. So Betty, you are now unmuted. So if you would like to ask a question, you can fire away.
Was that the first question we had?
Okay, Betty, it might be better for you to ask that question through the chat box.
And Vicki,
Yep.
you had a question?
And Vicki, you are unmuted.
Vicki Davis, Davila?
Oh, no question from me. I might have pushed the wrong button.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. So other questions you may have, you can either enter them in the chat box or you can raise your hand on the GoToWebinar controls.
And then on the last slide, we're highlighting the next two webinars. So we have one on February 7th as well as April 28th. February 7th, we will have schools showcasing some of their family engagement strategies, and they will be online to be able to answer questions for you.
Mm-hmm. And also, if you would like more information about either the slides or the webinars, you can feel free to reach out to Jennifer or myself, or also Michelle Belnavis or Sarah Sum, who are also part of our family engagement team.
With that, we thank you for attending. If there are any further questions, again, feel free to connect with us. Otherwise, have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.